Welcome to another Get Together from Get Abstract. I'm Andrew Savickas, Chief Strategy Officer at Get Abstract, and my guest today is Maria Colacurcio, the CEO of Syndio, a company focused on using data to improve pay equity. Prior to joining Syndio, Maria co-founded Smartsheet.com, a work collaboration tool for companies of all sizes. Maria has more than 20 years of experience in technology and communications at companies like Microsoft, Starbucks, and a number of technology startups she assures me you've never heard of. Maria is also a mom to 6 kiddos and makes sure to talk about family finances at the dinner table. Maria, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So a lot of companies have been talking about diversity and inclusion and more recently adding equity to the mix for years now, but it doesn't really seem to be making that much of a difference. Why do you think the way that companies have been doing diversity and inclusion has failed to deliver?
It's a great question, Andrew, and thanks for bringing it up because I think D&I has been a focus now for over a decade. But as you said, it's not making a meaningful difference in how we think about the future of work from the lens of fairness and equity. And I think there's a couple of reasons to that. Number one, the D&I efforts to date have not been measurable. So when you try to put action and incentives behind something, that's when things begin to change. So I'll give you an example. Many company leaders at the enterprise, mid-market, all the way down to the SMB level, want to know what the company's distribution looks like. So their gender, race, ethnicity, etc. They want to know, what do we look like today in terms of what that mix is across our organization from the lowest levels in terms of pay quartiles up to the highest levels. But more importantly, they want to understand what they should look like and how to get there. And for D&I to succeed, and of course now we're adding that E, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Leaders need actionable goals tied to metrics, rooted in analytics, tied to those demographics, not aspirational goals that are really untethered to reality. So those goals would show, for example, for each level and function in a company, what should the company look like given unbiased processes? And that's an example of a metric and how analytics and data can help start tying some of these actionable goals to these aspirations that we've been hearing for over a decade in D&I that haven't really played out.
So one of the ways a company can look at whether it's treating employees equitably is obviously analyzing how it pays people. What's the traditional way that companies do that?
Yeah, so the traditional way companies have done this, and really why the pay gap exists and why it's set to stick around for another 200 years, it's an indictment of the current solutions. And the current solutions include a company goes out, they hire an external law firm. The law firm and the client go back and forth with data, and it takes weeks, often months, just to get that first analysis back. It's clunky, it's expensive, it's slow. And unfortunately, once the client or the company receives that pay equity analysis, they learn where they need to remediate. So meaning they learn who they need to pay and how much, but they learn nothing about their underlying policies and practices that have been driving the disparity. So in that format, it's really a one and done that gets done once a year. It's painful enough that the company doesn't want to look at it again, so they shelve it. And what happens in every single scenario is that companies' problems will persist because they're happening at the policy and practice level. And the very next time they look at it, they will have these same problems in the same departments, typically for the same level of remediation, and they'll just pay it over and over and over again.
Wow. What kind of pay gaps do companies find when they start looking?
Yeah, so it really depends. I mean, the thing about the pay gap that we tell our customers all the time is you are probably going to have one. Because here's the thing about pay gaps. They occur wherever there is discretion, and discretion across large populations tend to favor the majority. And the majority in a lot of these companies, specifically if you look at the mid to high quartiles of salary, are men. So if you think about that principle, discretion across large populations typically favor men. Most companies, when they lift the hood, they're going to find some rust. And that's something that we encourage our customers to do all the time. In terms of board communication or executive level communication or sponsorship, we say, make sure to set reasonable expectations. You probably will find problems. And instead of inciting fear, that should give you some relief. You're not alone. This is what everyone is going through right now. The important thing is that you make a commitment to open the hood, to look, and to commit to a practice of ongoing analysis that's going to not only scrape the rust off that first time, but make sure that you stay in compliance over time with every small decision you make. So you're not having to have that big makeover every year where you pay a ton of money.
Right, right. But at the same time, I'm not aware of any company or CEO that would say they don't pay fairly, even if clearly a lot of it they do. What you hear people say is, well, no, we pay for performance. Yet clearly something else is really happening, right?
It is. And I think that's what's really interesting about applying innovation and software to this problem, because Syndio, for example, is the software. So I'm the CEO of the company,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, and we license software which helps companies analyze and resolve gaps due to gender, race, ethnicity, or any intersectionality of really any data you want to compare that you have in your system. And we predict the degree to which what companies say they pay for is actually true. And so we make that prediction net of gender or net of race or whatever it is that they want to look at, and then we compare it to actual. So what you find very quickly in really nice data visualizations is a company may say they pay for performance, a lot of them say that, but few actually do. And so without the tools to look at how your pay practices are actually correlating to pay, it's almost impossible to know whether a policy is working. And we see it all the time with tenure. Tenure is a great example. So a company will say, the longer you're here, our policy and practice is around increasing your compensation based on your tenure. But when you look at it in the context of our software, that's often true for men who are better at negotiating retention bonuses or retention increases or increasing that percentage per year on their salary
Mm-hmm.
calibration. But women tend to flatline, and that's either because maybe there's bias in the system, they're not as aggressive about negotiating, or potentially they're taking parental leave and getting penalized when they come back with not hitting that increased milestone based on tenure. So very quickly in looking at that visualization, a compensation manager can say, wow, we actually don't pay for tenure, and we've got to figure out what to do around this bias in negotiations, or potentially encourage our women to receive their calibration or their annual review, even if they're out on leave.
Oh, okay. So, you talked a little bit about the sort of current way of doing things. Lawyers every year, big headache, not really anything changing. And it does seem surprising that there's not a more modern approach. And so I'd love to hear a little more about, the approach that you're taking at Cindio. How are you doing things differently? What does your process look like compared to, let's bring in the lawyers once a year?
Yeah, it's very different, in fact. So a customer signs up with Syndio and immediately they upload their data from their HRIS. So we have an integration with Workday if that's what they use, or they can just export and import a flat file. And very quickly, immediately, they can see the unadjusted gap. So there's unadjusted and adjusted, and that's a technical differentiation that means before you add those neutral job related factors to explain why you pay what you pay. So immediately you can see all of your different functions and departments. You can see different groupings. So if you want to look at it functionally, if you want to look at it based on, for example, the EEO1 classifications of how you group employees, you can do that. And you can also look at all up comp, you can look at just base pay, you can look at bonuses, you can look at stock equity. And really what we're seeing more and more is that the hidden corners of pay and equity really are stock and incentive bonuses, because those are really nice, quiet, dark places to hide, places that aren't typically analyzed. So we really, really encourage our customers to look at all comp. And then from there, you can start to look at your policies. So you can start to identify which ones are working, which ones aren't. And then the tool very quickly shows you remediation. So who needs to be paid what. And then I think the piece of it that I'm certainly most excited about is a starting pay tool. And what that enables our customers to do is make sure that once they've hit pay equity for a functional grouping, that every time they're hiring someone new, they set that starting pay at the right level for internal equity. So many companies invest a lot of money in market pay. So making sure employees are paid fairly compared to market. But employees actually care a lot more now about whether they're paid fairly compared to peers at their own company. So what this starting pay tool does is it gives employers a range for a position based on those neutral policies that you have in place and tells you this is the range in which you should hire this person so you don't pull on that band of internal equity too much. And so what the result of that is you really do stay on top of it over time as your workforce changes, as you lay people off, as you hire people, as you reorg, you can stay on top of this issue so that you're not remediating, and therefore you're saving a massive amount of cost year over year.
Wow. So going back to the pay per performance theme, it's something I've heard a lot, especially regarding sales departments, where compensation is clearly tied directly to revenue. So people assume, well, it must be reasonably fair. Is that what you've seen when you do this analysis?
Sales teams are tricky. And I would say that there's a lot of inequity in sales as a function, specifically because territories are handed out with a lot of discretion. And just like we talked about earlier, anytime there's discretion, there's going to be issues. And so with sales functions particularly, there's a lot more in the policy piece of it than just sales based on revenue. Because the commission may be based on revenue, but where are they garnering that commission? Where is it coming from? Who has opportunity for greater commission? And how is that doled out? And what is the process there? Those are all of the questions that sales employees should be asking, because that's where the various disparities are going to hide.
Got it. Yeah, it makes sense. The discretion involved with, it's not just how are you doing this territory, but why did you get this territory and who gets to make those decisions? Absolutely.
Exactly.
Now, when a company gets the output of one of these kind of pay gap analyses, what do they typically kind of, what do they do with it once they've sort of presented with this information? What's the actual next step to try to start working on it?
Well, it's a really interesting question, especially I think in today's macro environment, because it's been, 6 months since George Floyd was murdered. And since then, the demand for equity, specifically around race, which was already making its way through our worlds and our workplaces, has reached an even higher pitch. So now there's really no way companies and CEOs can mess around with fairness and equity any longer. And it's not just gender. I think the conversation before that was very much centered on gender. And as a software company that enabled our customers to look at anything, we were constantly beating the drum of, don't stop at gender, look at race, look at orientation, look at, all of these other things that are available to you. And I think CEOs and boards are starting to realize that. So more and more, our customers are using the output of what they do in our software and bringing it to the board level and saying, here's what we're finding. Here's why we need an ongoing commitment to these issues. And once we solve pay equity, which is equal pay for equal work, they're coming back to us and saying, we want to engage your services and your software to address opportunity. And that's another side of what we do, which is helping companies figure out how to address, again, setting those appropriate realistic goals for how to create more diversity in their senior level management areas of the company.
Yeah, you're talking about that opportunity piece. It's obviously valuable for a company to look at their own pay practices, but these, as you've described it, that's talking primarily about the employees the company already has. What should companies do to look at improving equity when it comes to employees they don't have yet in the sort of recruiting and hiring pipeline? In addition to their own internal pipeline for opportunities.
Yeah, there's a lot of things a company can do for when they're talking to employees that haven't yet even joined the company. And one of those things is looking at starting pay. Hang on one second.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Okay. Anyhow, so it's obviously valuable for a company to look at their own pay practices, but that only covers employees that they already have. What should companies do to look at equity when it comes to recruiting and hiring before people actually even get in the door?
Yeah, great question. So the first piece of that is starting pay, which we talked about a little bit before. So making sure that every starting pay offer is within the bands of internal equity at the company. And that's really difficult to do because here's what happens. You have a very talented applicant, and the applicant is requesting pay that's higher than the internal bands of equity for the current team.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where you see issues constantly around employee engagement and employee satisfaction, is when, even to the degree that sometimes a hiring manager will be hiring an employee that will come in at a salary on par or higher than their own. And that creates a lot of discomfort in an organization. And so what you have to do is you have to set a pay and range that takes into account both market pay. So what is the market paying at that time, but also internal equity. And there's an intersection between the two. And by using software to do that, by integrating those two things, you can start to see very quickly in real time when your internal equity range is too low and it needs to be increased. So increasing people that have been with the company for a while, figuring out how to bring that market pay range down, and starting to train hiring managers to not just throw out any additional salary elements or title elements. That's the other piece of this. When a great candidate is negotiating for that in the hiring process. So that's kind of one piece of this, is staying true to the pay and range and to the starting pay that's within the bounds of internal equity. I think the other thing that's really interesting that our founder and chief data scientist is working on right now are things that have to do with resumes and job postings. So for example, expanding the breadth of an experience base required for a certain job. So if you say you're hiring a junior data scientist, for example, there's a lot of research happening right now, and he's at the forefront, our founder, of doing a lot of this, that shows if you just decrease the number of years of experience required, let's say it's, the original job posting was 7 to 10 years of experience. If you lower it to 5, for example, the percentage of minority and women applicants that you will get just from that slight change in experience is tremendous. So thinking about things like that, or another example, at Cindio, we do impact descriptions. So we change the nature and the way that we write a job description to be much more broad and to focus on less on the experience and the specifics around the experience and more on the skills. So what skills are required to do this job? What does success look like? What will you have achieved in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? And in doing that and phrasing it like that, you just get a wider range of humans who look at the job posting and say, I could do this. This is something that I could do. And it's really important that you approach it that way if you do have a goal of enhancing diversity in your company.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Now, we've obviously been talking a lot about pay, but there's plenty of data out there about millennials who I think now make up the largest single cohort in the workforce, as well as Gen Z. That money isn't actually the most important thing for them when it comes to job satisfaction. If that's the case, how much time and energy should companies spend on looking at pay versus other areas for improving diversity, equity, and inclusion? And clearly, it's not one or the other.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think millennials don't care as much about pay, but what they really care about are fairness-based practices, and on the reverse, unfairness-based practices. So I think when you're thinking about pay as a lever for employee engagement, you're correct. But I think when you're thinking as a company about employee engagement on the whole, employees do care very much that their employer is a fair workplace and that they're giving opportunities for promotion and advancement and development fairly across the organization. So it's kind of like, trust and transparency are two sides of the same coin. And it's a similar issue. Millennials want to trust that their company is being transparent about how they compensate and give opportunities to the employees. And when a company is transparent about those things, it then engenders trust from the millennial population. So it may not be that they care about, I want to go work for a place that pays me really well. That might not be priority one, but I can tell you that in that top set of priorities is I want to work for a place that I know is fair. And so it kind of goes hand in hand in terms of fairness-based pay policies and retention.
Got it. No, that makes total sense. Based on what you've seen working with your customers, are there certain kinds of companies or industries that tend to perform better or worse when it comes to pay equity?
I would say there's different Motivations. So some
Okay.
sets of industries are motivated very much by fear and the fear of litigation and wanting to
Hmm.
reduce the risk of litigation around a gender pay equity class action. Whereas other sectors like tech, I think tech is a really great example in general, but specifically the mid-market fast growing tech companies of progressive companies whose motivation is to do the right thing and to make sure in a very, very tight job market that they have additional levers to draw minorities, women, and millennials to their company. And a lot of these practices are things that will do that. I think we have a long way to go in banking and financial services and insurance. I think a lot of them are approaching this and starting to do it, but it very much is from a reduction in legal risk perspective, which again, as a company, we don't judge your motivation as to why
Hmm.
you come to us. We're just happy you're engaging in the activity of pursuing fair pay. But there is quite a difference in the motivation, I think, industry by industry.
Okay. Thank you. Now you sort of alluded to this earlier, but one of the contributors to pay inequity is the so-called motherhood penalty, resulting from being out of the workforce with young kids for a period of time. It's is something, is that something that how has that affected your own career trajectory?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and anyone who's interested in this topic, I would recommend going to pick up. Lisa Stromberg has a book called "Work, Pause, Thrive" that's excellent on the topic. She talks about it all the time, and her main point is that not all people have a linear career trajectory, and that's okay. And a lot of women make decisions and choices, a lot of men too, to amp up their career or bring it down depending on what's going on in their life. And I think for me, someone who co-founded a tech company that went public, it was very successful, but took a couple of years off to spend time at home with my young kids and then was re-entering the workforce. I found a very unfriendly environment, even as someone who felt I had had a lot of success. I had led teams. I had been in marketing and communications for tech for a decade or more. And it was really difficult to explain that gap on my resume. People were very hung up on, well, what were you doing? And
Hmm.
did you get soft? And did you lose your skills? And I think from my perspective as a leader in a company now, we've really got to look at skills over experience. And it's very similar to how Starbucks, which is where I ended up post Gap, because they were very, very welcoming to that concept of skills over experience. And I think it's partly because of the work they do with veterans.
Hmm.
So they have a very robust veterans hiring program. And as they're looking at veterans to hire into the corporate workplace, they very much translate the skills someone was able to compile while serving and then try to translate that into what does that mean for what their work would be in a corporate environment. Because we all know when people fail at work, it's the how they're getting work done, not necessarily that they didn't serve as a B2B marketing director for the appropriate amount of years. It's how they get work done. It's how they
Hmm.
lead. It's how they interact. And these are all things that can be cultivated and achieved in other environments like motherhood and like serving. So I think that's what I learned is the lesson I took that I talked to other leaders about, which is, are you looking at skills or are you just looking at experience? And if you broaden your view a bit, we can
Hmm.
offer opportunities to people that have maybe taken a few years to do other things. And that's not a bad thing for our workplace.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you mentioned this a little earlier in talking about your own, making changes to the job descriptions about impact based. And so, as your own experiences, having gone through what you did with your sort of the gap you were away, your experience with Starbucks, as a CEO yourself, what is that? How does that affected your own approach to diversity, equity, inclusion at Syndio right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's always a struggle because you're always having to balance time and efficiency versus the right thing to do. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So, number one, in order to have a qualified applicant pool to make sure it's a diverse slate of candidates, that takes time,
Mhm.
especially depending on the demographic area in which you're hiring. And so you really do have to slow down to speed up. You have to slow down. You have to make sure you're looking at a qualified applicant pool and that you have all the right mix and that you feel really good about that mix before you make a hire. And that's something that takes a lot of discipline, especially at a startup with 25, 26 people. You know, every single hire we had to have yesterday. We probably
Right.
waited too long to open the head count in the first place. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is I'm really open to part-time. So I have a couple of women that work for us who they have young kids at home and they want to be in the workforce, but they can't do it 5 days a week. And so I think being open to giving them not only a career, but a career where they can still progress and they can still develop and they can still grow is really important, because eventually those kids will be in school and they will want to step in a
Mhm.
little more, and so we're providing them opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the part-time thing. That's something I have found, myself in joining Get Abstract. It's just a Swiss company with a lot of employees in Europe. It's refreshing to see that be a much more common, both for men and women, to have both the expectation, understanding that there are time periods when people will want to be part-time, and that those are not necessarily indefinite. That is this sort of dipping in and out. And I think it's something that love to see more companies here in the States, respect that approach.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So one final question that I try to ask all the guests that come on. Obviously we value and care a lot about reading and books and their ability to help people make better decisions. What is your favorite business book and why?
Oh, that's going to be a tough one for me. um I've always loved The Hard Thing About Really Hard Things, whatever that,
Yeah,
I might
yeah.
be getting the title wrong. And part of the reason I love it is because it really challenged, and that book's been around a long time. I've read it a couple of times. And it challenges some really obvious assertions and some really obvious presumptions that I think we make as leaders, in terms of the right person for the job isn't always the most obvious choice. And if you actually challenge yourself to think about, again, not to beat a dead horse, but skills versus experience, what is the how and how this person is going to achieve the job? I think it challenges some of those assumptions in a way that's really meaningful, in terms of putting your team first and thinking about every single decision you make and how that's building your culture, and thinking about how you react and act, not only in times of crisis, because I think actually the reverse is typically true to the assumption, which is we tend to show up as our best selves in crisis.
Hmm.
And it's in times of success that really test us in terms of our integrity and the type of leaders that we are. It's when we can get sloppy and soft and lose our way. And I think that book does a good job of setting those reminders, regardless of size, stage, or where you're at.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. So I'm not surprised to hear that as one you picked. Well, Maria, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated the chance to get to know you and learn more about Syndio and what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.